Okay. Good day, creatures. Today is Monday. Today is the start of a new week, so we are a little bit on the depressed side for everyone who had to go back to work. Meanwhile, yours truly is going to go instead and look at a Mythic Plus, because yesterday we looked at the raid, so, you know, Mythic Plus and raid go hand in hand when we look at things like, you know, our specs and classes and whatnot going into the activity. We haven't looked at the raid in almost 2 resets. We haven't looked at Mythic Plus in over 2 resets, so it's a good moment to go back and look at how things are going. But we're doing something slightly different this time because, you know, previously I only ever looked, for a few weeks, I have only ever been looking at keys higher than plus 20, higher than plus 25 even, to see the upper ranks of the meta. But for this version, okay, for this edition, for this episode of the Mythic Plus recap, I'm also gonna look at the lower keys in general, because, you know, at the end of the day, sure, higher keys are more difficult and more competitive, but this is your average run-of-the-mill number of runs in the different key levels. So as you can see, there are 2 spikes in the keys. One is the 15 and one is the 20. The 15, of course, for the Keystone Master achievement, and then the plus 20 to get your teleport achievement, as well as to get 3000 rating, so you can get, for example, the max level conduits from the reputation from the Enlightened. So as you can see, plus 15s are still very popular, so I thought we would have started to look also at a slightly lower level in Mythic Plus keys. Of course, it doesn't mean that what is meta there is very important. You could very easily clear a plus 15 key with every single combination of classes and specs in the game, but let's just start with the all level keys with tanks. At the all level of keys, we have the continuation of the popularity of Protection Paladin. Once again, nobody quite knows why so many people like to play Protection as a tank. Still, we do also see Protection Warrior being a little bit more popular than what we will see later on as the keys get more difficult. When it comes to healers, it's actually much more balanced. When it comes to healers, there isn't really as much of a dominance of Resto Shaman in all of the keys. You can see that Resto Druid, for example, and Holy Priest are very close to the Shaman. Melee DPS, we have the confirmation that Survival is a very meta last minute change from the last patch, because if Survival was a super popular spec, on top of how powerful it would have gotten to the 15, perhaps even closer to 20% popularity. Instead, it is quite far back, both Fury and Havoc Demon Hunter, when it comes to the entirety of the key range. And lastly, you have the range DPS. The range DPS, you still have the split, a very even split as far as all keys are concerned for Beast Mastery and Marksmanship. And then you have the 2 other pure DPS classes that are more split between Frost and Fire and Destro and Demo, which will continue in most cases as you go higher in keys. This one, on the other hand, is a situation in keys higher than 20. When we go into tanks, we still continue to see the, you know, popularity, the strength of Protection Paladin at this level of key, the teleport portals, achievement range. Prot Paladin is still doing quite well. Blood Decay starts rising a little bit more. It has continued to rise also from last week, so positive change for them in the last couple of resets. Where we start, of course, seeing the more significant of the switches, of the changes, is when you go into the highest of keys, into the 25 and up keys, because that's when Blood Death Knight takes over. 1 in 3 tanks at that level of difficulty are going to be Blood. Prot Paladin loses, you know, almost... Prot Paladin loses quite a lot, well over 50% of the representation, and in return, it's Brewmaster Monk that gains also significant popularity in the highest level of keys. Always quite interesting to see Guardian Druid, which started very, very fast. You know, they were right off the gates very quickly up into the meta in this season, but then they started kind of sizzling out over time. Other specs have taken over now. It's still not a bad tank, it's definitely a very good tank, much like we say every week, every time we go over the Mythic Plus situation, the tank situation is the best it has ever been in a long time, so very good situation for tanks. Healers now. So healers are not as good as tanks are. We keep repeating this. We have Mistweaver and Discipline, which are pretty much dead specs as soon as you start getting into the 20 range. And then you have the similar continued chase of Holy Priest trying to get closer and closer to Resto Shaman. This week, Holy Priest is now at a measly 5.3% away from Resto Shaman. So it is the closest they've ever been to being the most popular spec in Mythic Plus in this level of keys. Also, Resto Druid still continues to solidify itself as the third most played healer in Mythic Plus at this level of key. Then, at the highest of the high levels, we do also have another new record, because even in keys higher than 25 we have Holy Priest now 10.2% away from Resto Shaman, also a new record in how close they can get to being the most popular of healers. Holy Paladin keeps dropping a few points in popularity. They have fallen off quite a bit since their significant round of nerfs to their damage, which forced them out of Ventir, so now they are not as well performing as other specs. There is once again the growth of Survival, because we left last time with Survival already claiming the #1 spot for most popular spec in keys higher than 20. Now they claim it even harder, because now they have even increased by 10% compared to the last time. They are even more in the clear as the most popular of melee DPS specs. As I said, it's quite interesting to see the comparison between their overall key popularity and their high level popularity, right? Survival is not a very played spec overall, so once players see that it's very meta and very strong for high keys, for pushing high keys, only the more competitive, the more hardcore of players will bother to switch to Survival, to reroll to Survival and try to push it, as opposed to other specs which are much more easy to see a flood of players jump into them. Say, you know, Mage, Warlock, Demon Hunter, it's always very easy to see them become very popular when they are strong. For Survival, it's not been as much of a gain, but still, at high level, they continue to be very meta. The most meta of melee, which is a title they continue to hold at the highest level of keys. Much like in the +20 and higher, even in this highest level, they continue to be even more popular. Now, slightly more than 1 in 3 DPS you will see in keys of this level will be Survival Hunters. And then the rest of the slots are going to be split between Rogues as the second highest most likely chance, and then in third place you have the split between Havoc, Windwalker and Fury Warrior. Very, very few chances for the remaining specs to be considered at this level of keys. Lastly, you have the ranged DPS, which perhaps gets into an even worse situation than what the melee DPS are in, because in keys higher than 20 you see the usual. Marksmanship is much more popular than BM, you have Frost being quite more popular, almost twice as much more popular than Fire, and then you have Destro and Demo being both popular. Calling Demonology unpopular just because it's very far behind Destro is kind of wrong, since they are almost the third most played spec anyways, despite being gapped so much by Destro. This gets even worse. This gets even worse once we go into the highest level of keys, because at that level Destro gained even more. They went from 37% to 41.7%. This might be one of the highest numbers of representation of players we have seen. I think I remember something about Outlaw Rogues in some of the seasons of BFA perhaps being this high, but still, for this expansion, this is definitely a record high. Perhaps only Resto Shaman for a bit kept this level of participation in the high key levels. What is also even more depressing is that despite having this much of a gigantic gap to the rest of the ranged, the second most played ranged DPS at this level is still another Warlock spec, because it's Demonology, who, despite having almost 1 in 2 DPS, ranged DPS in Mythic Plus being Destro's, still the second most with 16.3% is Demonology. The only other option you might see is going to be Mage. As I said, it's not as big of a gap in this level of keys for mages. Frost and Fire are much more close to each other. But to close this point, ranged DPS are perhaps the worst of all of them, because, you know, when you take Balance, Arcane, Elemental, Shadow, Marksmanship, and BM together, they don't even make up the same number of Frost Mage. So, you know, it's quite a sad situation for ranged DPS, especially because, you know what's even sadder for ranged? The popular specs are within the same class. So if instead of having this layout, you had the exact same numbers, but instead of being like this, they were for Shadow Priest, Elemental Shaman, Frost Mage, and Demonology, you would have quite more of a spread of viable and, you know, varied picks in Mythic Plus. But the fact that 2 of them are for Mage and 2 of them are for Warlock makes things a little bit more boring, a little bit more tedious when you go into a key. You kind of get fatigued seeing the exact same spec every single time, to be honest. Talking about seeing the exact single specs every time, this is what happened over time, slowly but consistently. You can see the growth over time of Destruction Warlock, which started towards the bottom half of DPS and then made its way all the way up to the top. An inverse reaction happened to Frost Mage. Frost Mage started at the top as a very good AoE damage spec in Mythic Plus, and then over time, as you can see, starts fizzling out a little bit more towards middle of the pack compared to where they started this season. Talking about the change in tanks for this season of Mythic Plus, it's quite self-explanatory. There is blood. That is the growth of Blood Death Knight over time, and the absolute lack of growth, of course, of Protection Warrior right at the bottom. Interestingly enough, or perhaps boringly enough, the growth of healers isn't really as visible. In fact, there doesn't seem to be much of any for healers in Mythic Plus for this season. To close things off, to put things even more into perspective, I wanted to see the differences between the popularity of the specs between the three gaps of the meta, the 3 checkpoints, breakpoints of the meta, the plus 15, the plus 20, and the plus 25 range. So the plus 15 range is going to be over there, plus 20 range shows up in the middle, and the plus 25 range is going to be over there, and these are how much the specs are being played. I wanted to put them side by side because it's gonna look kind of fun, right? Or depressing, depending on which side of the spectrum you are, to see the repeated names of the specs multiple times in the same slots. In particular, the one that jumps to my eyes the most is Affliction. You know, at Mythic Plus 15, only 3,800 Affliction specs being played is quite depressing. Obviously, this has to do with how Destruction and Demonology are right now. So why would you even want to play Affliction when they are this strong? But still, it is sad, right? It is sad that only 6 Affliction Warlocks have ever seen a plus 25 key this season. It also puts definitely quite into perspective when you look at the plus 25 range, the gargantuan gap between Destro, Survival, and the rest of the DPS. Just look at them. You have the gap with the healers and tanks with the Resto Shaman, Holy Priest, Brewmaster Monk, Blood DK, and after that, you know, it's quite a barren wasteland of specs compared to the 2 at the top. As I said, I am quite disappointed at the supposed AoE nerf that was being given to Survival and Destro, because as we can see quite clearly, it's now been 2 resets or 3 resets, almost 3 resets. This AoE nerf hasn't really done anything at all for both of the specs. So perhaps we are a little bit too late into the tier to start worrying about nerfs, right? So maybe in prospect, okay, to get into the next season of Shadowlands, perhaps we can start looking into it, into tuning the power of the AoE of these 2 specs a little bit more. So this was the recap of this week's Mythic Plus right before we get into the next affix combination this Wednesday or this Tuesday, NA or U, wherever you are. This being said, we are running late already, so thank you guys for watching the video and for helping to grow and support the channel just by tuning in. You can do more by liking and commenting down below, of course. This is what YouTube wants you to do for reasons not very well understood. Also, another thing, you can stop by to the subscribe button to help even more my channel, but for today, only players above this line in popularity of Mythic Plus are allowed to subscribe to the channel for today. this being said, thank you guys again. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I would like to congratulate my youngest sister for her amazing taste in giving gifts for people's birthday, because this is what I get.